I'm not an engineer. I'm a transportation planner. Been in the business a long time. This is a picture from my childhood in Worcester, Massachusetts, and it's Worcester Union Station, which after this went into complete ruin and has since been renovated to be a real showplace. The train on the right is the New York Central's New England States heading for Chicago. And in the background there on the left is a rail diesel car belonging to the New Haven Railroad that was about to leave for New London, Connecticut. The two trains used to leave at 4:48 p.m. every day. So I work currently and have almost 16 years now in the Chicago office, downtown Chicago, right above Union Station, and working on a wide variety of transit and passenger rail projects. I have not done any freight rail work except as it's involved peripherally from passenger projects. So we're going to talk today about some of the key design issues for all modes of passenger rail and transit. You won't see any formulas because I don't do formulas. As I say, I'm a planner, not an engineer. But we're going to focus on the principles. So first we're going to talk about intercity passenger service. All intercity trains in the United States are operated by Amtrak with their own trains, their own crews. Of course, it's a FRA railroad, all regulated by the Federal Railroad Administration. The services operated in really three different ways. There's regional service, and that those are routes that are less than 750 miles, and they operate the Northeast Corridor, Boston to Washington, and the branch out to Harrisburg, is owned by Amtrak. It's the biggest single, by far the biggest asset owned by Amtrak. It's all electrified, and top speed on this part of the railroad is 150 miles an hour. This section in New Jersey is in the process of being raised to 160. Most stations have high-level platforms that's 48 inches above top of rail to allow level boarding with conventional single-deck passenger cars. And the Northeast Corridor trains, it's important to understand the finances behind each of these regimes. The Northeast Corridor service is figured to be pretty much the operating costs are funded from the fares. So nobody pays Amtrak operating costs for the Northeast Corridor except the riders. There is no subsidy. However, the rest of the country is a whole different story. The rest of the country is not self-supporting because the service is slower. It's not as attractive. There's a lot more competition. So it is subsidized, supported, and in the regional trains are supported by the states. Almost all the costs of the regional trains are supported by the states. In the rest of the country, the passenger trains are diesel operated, and the top speed in Michigan and Illinois is 110 miles an hour in some sections. Otherwise, as a generality, the top speed of all the Amtrak routes is typically 79 miles per hour. There's a history behind that being 79 and versus 80, not worth getting into. And then the other part of the Amtrak operation, the third leg of the stool, if you will, is the long-distance trains. These are overnight trains. They operate through multiple states. The biggest concentration of them is in Chicago, where 8 of these trains, 8 of the 13 originate. There's overnight, 2-night trains that go to the West Coast, Seattle and Portland, San Francisco, Los Angeles, and then 1-night trains that go to New York and Washington. So the long-distance trains generally operate 1 train a day, and they operate almost entirely over the freight railroads, except, of course, in Chicago itself, where Amtrak owns Union Station and the associated tracks in the vicinity of the station. So the equipment varies from on the Northeast Corridor. There's the Acela trains, high-speed trains for regional service. The other typical train for the long-distance trains are the double-deck superliner trains used out of Chicago and on some of the other routes for the long-distance service. There's coaches and sleeping cars and dining cars and lounge cars with the sightseeing roof, and some equipment that in many ways is the envy of the world. But these superliners are getting old. These are typically about 30 years old now, so they're going to have to be replaced in the not too distant future. The Acela trains, Amtrak is in the process of procuring replacement for those trains too. Those are not young either, and they don't have enough of them. So that's the dual purpose of that procurement. The regional service operates with a lot more variety of equipment. The most common in the Midwest currently is the single-deck trains that you see over here on the right. And trains like that also operate in New England and New York State. And then in California, there's these double-deck cars, kind of like superliners, but not exactly the same. The surfliners that you see there. And cars of that design were ordered under an ERA grant for both the Midwest and more cars for California. Unfortunately, there's been a problem with the design of those cars. They've failed an FRA compression test, so it's not exactly clear what's going to, and the funding has a sunset provision to it as an ERA contract, so it's not clear what's going to happen on that. That's a very tricky situation right now. And then on the left, you see the Talgo trains. These are operated in the Northwest between Vancouver, Seattle, Portland, and down to Eugene, Oregon. And that service is operated exclusively with these Talgo trains. They are a Spanish design, and they tilt on the curves, which allows them to go through the curves faster. So just talk about concepts, the various design issues. Speed limits for passenger trains are always set higher than freight trains. An important factor is that the top speed through grade crossings is effectively 110 miles per hour. Sometimes you see references to 125. That's not the requirements to get the FRA to allow you to do 125 through grade crossings are so complex that nobody has even attempted it. So you have to accept the fact that the limit for going through grade crossings is 110. And even to get to 110, there are very stringent requirements. Effectively, you have to meet the same requirements as quiet zones if you've encountered that issue. Now, super elevation is a big deal. It needs to be set differently because the trains are running at higher speeds. The super elevation really should be set higher on passenger routes than on freight routes. This is an ongoing source of friction between, no pun intended, between the owning freight railroads and the passenger railroads. So that can be a big issue. Then, of course, the other point of friction between the freight railroads and Amtrak is the whole issue of capacity. This is a big deal. Because the passenger trains are less forgiving, the passengers are less forgiving than freight, and there is legislation that requires passenger trains to be given priority. The freight railroads generally provide that priority. Amtrak does complain sometimes and has, in fact, sued freight railroads because they weren't giving them the priority that they think the law entitles them to, and that issue has gone to the Supreme Court, and it's not totally resolved. So that's a ongoing major point of contention. I think the bottom line is that I think what we're seeing is that passenger trains on freight railroads work fine, for if you try to run one train a day. But if you want multiple trains per day, you may have to accept the fact that sooner or later you may have to build your own railroad for passenger trains. There may be just too many differences. That's kind of a conclusion I'm coming to. I'm not sure if everybody's accepted. I know not everybody has accepted that, but that's, I think, the direction things are starting to move. Platforms are another big issue regulated by the Federal Railroad Administration, and in fact by the overall Department of Transportation has published regulations on that. So this is essentially the law. Passenger in most parts of the country, what the law requires is level boarding as the default, and level boarding is either 48 inches above top of rail for the standard traditional single level cars that are used in the Northeast and some other places, and then the Superliner level boarding, these double deck cars, and that applies to the California regional cars also. That's 15 inches above top of rail. And so, of course, the freight railroads say that that conflicts with freight operations, not all freight operations, but wide loads. So every few months they may have a movement that that involves cars that are wider than normal freight cars. Those are called wide loads, and so they would conflict with high-level platforms. And so the regulation requires that on publicly owned tracks, that so if it's owned by Amtrak or one of the states, they require that the platforms be set at the high level to provide the level boarding. But on freight railroads, on freight tracks, the regulations allow them to be set at 8 inches above top of rail, which of course does not provide level boarding, and then portable lifts or some other provision to provide access to the trains has to be provided. And Amtrak has been working pretty hard, spending a fair amount of money to bring their stations into compliance to provide ADA access to their passenger trains, either with level boarding platforms, high-level platforms, or with lifts on 8-inch platforms, and in places where the platforms are really old-fashioned and are at railhead height or something. They're working with the states to build 8-inch platforms. I guess, since I think we do have time, if people have questions, they should feel free to. I'll take a pause here, see if anybody has any questions. Is everybody still there? Hello?
David, we're here.
Okay. All right. No questions?
I'm not getting anything in the chat, so.
Okay.
They're a quiet crowd.
Yeah, I guess. Okay. I had one person respond on screen that they're there, so that's good. All right, moving on. Maybe we'll take one other break at some point, appropriate place in the presentation, then at the end. So you have a whole other presentation on high-speed rail, so I'm not going to get into the details. But from kind of a policy perspective, there are a few things to keep in mind. The high-speed rail is, first of all, let's see what is high-speed rail. And essentially, as is defined in the United States, it's railroads that operate at more than 150 miles per hour, and as a cruising speed. And in the rest of the world, a very common threshold is 300 kilometers per hour, which is 186, and 350 is not unheard of. There's several places that's operated. That's 220 miles per hour, and so that's a real game changer. That's obviously much faster than driving. So what's been found, I think it's fairly universal, is that trains can be competitive in markets very competitive. Like they can pretty much wipe out air competition in markets where the trains can get between cities, between endpoints, or between cities in 3 or 4 hours or less. They can be very competitive in markets where they get between cities in 5 hours or less. And they really make a very substantial dent in air service in those markets, and of course in automobiles usage. So like every other railroad, they are subject to FRA regulation. FRA regulations for really high that they only the published regulations only go up to 150, and so they're in the process of developing regulations for railroads that go faster than that. They're really having to work on those regulations now because, of course, there are the California high-speed rail system is under construction, and the Texas Central Railroad between Dallas and Houston is in the advanced portion of the environmental process, and it's expected to go into construction next year or the year after. So they're going to have to, and so they're going to have to get these regulations out pretty soon. Without regulations being published, the railroads are subject to what's called a rule of particular applicability. How's that for a mouthful? And so they're kind of custom regulations for individual railroads, and those are subject to negotiation, and none of those have actually been published as yet. The general policy or expectation is that when high-speed rail lines are true high-speed rail lines are put in corridors between major cities and attract good ridership. We're talking about trains that operate every hour, or maybe in peak periods every half hour. So 25 trains a day per route, or thereabouts, or more. These trains will operate at a profit, as the Northeast Corridor does. They will, however, I don't think there's any place in the world where they actually pay back all of their construction costs. If you're real lucky, they may pay for a new set of equipment eventually. But generally speaking, it's considered good that they operate it, that they cover all their operating costs, and there's some that have paid a portion of their construction costs, but I hate to put a number on this, but maybe a quarter if you're in really good corridors. Okay, that's intercity, and I spent a lot of time on that. We'll go through some of these others a little bit faster probably. Commuter railroads, these serve all the larger United States cities. They're all publicly owned. They may not be publicly operated. There are third-party contractors that operate several. We'll talk about that down a couple here. The track ownership can be by a public agency, possibly the same agency that's operating the trains. Amtrak, and there's a lot of commuter operations in the Northeast Corridor, which is owned by Amtrak. So in that case, there's half a dozen public agencies that operate on Amtrak tracks in the Northeast Corridor. And of course, there's a number of freight railroads that own the track that commuter trains operate on. Yeah. So the operation can either be by the public agency owner or under contract, sometimes by the freight railroad that owns the track. In Chicago, we have two notable examples of that. The BNSF operates a very big commuter operation out to Aurora, and then you know, and the trains all say Metra on them, but the train crews on those trains, they wear uniforms that say Metra, but the employees are getting a paycheck from BNSF. And a similar situation applies on the three lines that are owned by the Union Pacific, former Chicago and Northwestern routes, but there are other routes where the operation may be operated by a third-party contractor, Herzog or Keolis, and those types of for-profit operators, some of them from overseas, where this is also a common practice, and that also can work very effectively. Almost all commuter operations share tracks with freight trains. Sometimes the freight sharing is pretty negligible. You know, maybe one train a day and may operate at night. But there are some, particularly here in Chicago, there's extreme cases where, and the Chicago Aurora line and the Union Pacific West line out of Chicago, where they're kind of 50-50, and there's an understanding. It's unclear. It's kind of a secret subject whether or not it's a legal requirement, but there's certainly an understanding that that in the rush hour, the passenger trains, the commuter trains have priority, and they can't expect to operate hardly any freight trains. They can kind of sometimes ask the dispatcher if they could sneak a train in between the commuter trains, and if the freight dispatcher promises to stay out of the way of the passenger trains, the dispatcher may allow them to do that. And then a similar situation is in there's one unique operation in the country between Richmond and Washington, D.C., where there's, on part of that, there's a very heavy commuter operation. There's a substantial Amtrak operation, about 8 trains a day in each direction, and a very busy freight operation. And that line is actually operating at, or some would say, over capacity, and it's unable to provide reliable service for all of those users. And so the state is working with Amtrak and the FRA to put a third track on that main line, which should relieve a lot of congestion. Of course, commuter railroads like intercity railroads are all subject to FRA regulation. They operate a wide variety of equipment, electric multiple units, either with third rail power, overhead wire power, diesel double-deck equipment. There's the picture on the top right with the mountain in the background. Those are the Bombardier cars that about a dozen operators in the United States and Canada use. Excuse me. And you see the locomotives at the back of the train. The engineer operates from a cab at the front of the first passenger car. The rest of the cars probably don't have cabs. down at the bottom right is the gallery cars, which are favored by Metro in Chicago and VRE in Virginia, operating on that line from Richmond, as I said, uses those, and there's some in the San Francisco Bay Area and in Montreal. And then on the bottom left, there's diesel multiple unit trains. There's only a handful of operations that use trains like that. So again, the design issues are speed, and there's the super elevation issues that I mentioned that vary from freight trains. Grades. There are commuter rail operations that operate with up to 4% grades in passenger-only situations. Railroads won't accept 4% grades for freight operations, although I am aware of at least one case where a passenger railroad built a 4% grade, and a freight railroad went ahead and started operating some of their intermodal trains over that. Kind of interesting. And the capacity is obviously a big issue. And then we get into the same level boarding requirements. Those same FRA Department of Transportation requirements for level boarding apply as we talked about previously. And so again, 8 inches above top of rail is common, but in the Northeast Corridor, where the bulk of commuter rail operations are, it's 48 inches. Okay, then we have heavy rail transit, sometimes referred to as Metro, and these are separate systems. They're not interchangeable with the freight railroads. They do not have any freight operation. They typically operate with third rail, although there's a couple of examples of using overhead wire. And there's exceptions to every rule, but generally speaking, they have no grade crossings. They do all operate with high-level platforms. I don't think there's any exceptions to that. Lots of tunnels, a lot of structures, and that's how they avoid grade crossings. And yeah, these are 10-car trains are common, but sometimes as few as 1 or 2 cars also. It happens in some other cities, like I guess Cleveland is one, operates a lot of 1-car trains. So they use third rail power, except in New York, I think now is the only exception. They all use single-person crews. Oh, Boston may be another exception. They all pretty much use turnstile fare collection, so there's no onboard fare collection. And in most cases, all axles are powered, which is why they can easily do 4% grades. I think there's a couple that have grades higher than that. A typical top speed is, on these systems, is 55. We talked about grades. Yeah, they have a lot of capacity with these 10-car trains, and of course, they typically operate with more standing passengers than seated passengers in the peak hour, and they can operate as close to to each other as every 2 minutes. So you can imagine a 10-car train operating 30 trains an hour with standing loads can carry a lot of people. The rule of thumb that's often quoted is 40,000 people per hour per direction. A lot of people. and we talked about platforms. Okay, the next mode we're going to talk about, and kind of, you notice we're on kind of a continuum here, is light rail. This is a mode that it has, as a separate defined mode, has really only existed in the United States since 1981. San Diego was the first, had the first system. And what defines light rail is that it has dedicated lanes or separate tracks. You see on the right is, regular railroad-looking ballasted track, but on the left you see it operating in the middle of the street, but on dedicated lanes. There are, but you see on the left there, they operate through signalized, intersections, like this, and they have to respect the traffic signals. If that traffic light turns red, that train will stop. And now they typically get signal priority in most cities, so that they'll only get a red light if something doesn't work properly. But they are subject to traffic lights. They operate in these situations with no signals. They operate on site. But then these operations, like you see on the right, where they're operating up to like 65 miles per hour, they'll have a signal system. The newer systems operate with, provide level boarding with low-level platforms which matches the height of the floor of the cars. At least sometimes the cars may have like steps inside the cars, so that part of the car will be low floor and the other part over the trucks will be a higher floor. So the platforms are about 12 inches on those systems. Grade crossings are quite common, and so sometimes they may operate with gates. You see on the left here. Well, in fact, both these examples, these crossings are controlled by crossing gates. So sometimes they use crossing gates, sometimes traffic signals, and kind of depends on the system policy and the particular conditions at the intersection. A lot depends on sight lines. The length of trains are generally limited to what will fit within a block. So that if the train stops, they should not be blocking cross streets. So that's typically about 3-car trains are the limit. But the trains consist of articulated cars that bend in the middle, so those can be fairly long cars. The 6% grades are fairly common on these light rail systems, and almost all of them use proof of payment fare collection. These stations with 12-inch platforms that are just kind of in the middle of the street, you can't install turnstiles and have them be effective. So they accept that. They take advantage of it by having access from multiple directions to these stations. But so passengers are required to carry proof of payment. They have to have a ticket in their pocket, and if these inspectors, like you see here on the right, come along, they have to pull that proof of payment out of their pocket. Or now there's apps that do all this stuff, and the inspectors often carry cell phones with little readers that can read the electronic fare collection, fare cards that people carry. I made a note here that platforms often actually serve as the sidewalk. So you really can't control access to that platform. And then I make a note here on the left. There's a picture of a white bar signal, and so where the traffic is governed by red, green, and yellow lights, there are often cases where, with signal priority in particular, where you want the light rail moving on a separate set of signal cycles. So to avoid confusion, they use these white bar signals, horizontal being stop, and vertical is go. Sometimes there's a diagonal, which means a left turn or a right turn. And these are a concept brought over from Europe. So you'll see signals like that in a lot of places. Okay, there's a few cases, like a handful, where there are diesel light rail trains. These are usually light rail trains that do not meet FRA compression standards. So the way that the FRA ensures safety is that these operations have to apply for each one has to apply for a waiver, and generally speaking, the way you get a waiver is that you promise, and you have to have systems to enforce the fact that you'll not share track at the same time. This is called temporal separation. And then there's like here on the left, it's in Austin, Texas. Part of the operation may be in the street, and it's not actually shared with freight trains. So there may be a mixture, some passenger-only segments with mixed segments. Okay, so finally we get to streetcars, and this is what light rail evolved from. This technology goes back to the late 1800s, and you notice that these cars, none of them have couplers. Again, there's exceptions to everything, but most of these systems operate with single cars, although the modern one that you see on the right is articulated, so it's a little longer than a traditional streetcar. But yeah, so these cars are 45, 50 feet long. The articulated ones may be a little bit longer, and they operate in the street, and they may, in many places, actually share a lane with mixed traffic with automobiles. Curves on these systems, because the cars are so short, can be very tight. It's 40-foot radius curves are not unheard of, and so that for people who are used to railroad design, that can look pretty strange. And these systems, almost all of them, historically, until recently, they all operated with overhead wire. Overhead wire, and these operate generally with streetcar systems with just a wire with no messenger. This is why it's called trolley wire, because the way back when, the original ones actually had a little troller that rolled along the top of the wire. That didn't last very long, but the name stuck. So that's why these are called streetcars or trolleys in a lot of cities, and and that's called the trolley wire. And you may have noticed, I should have pointed out that on these other systems with light rail, where there's higher speed operations, and obviously Amtrak in the Northeast Corridor, they use a messenger wire that supports that wire. So the streetcars track is very different from standard track. I mean, streetcars can operate on standard track with ties and rail, but the real focus is, of course, on their operation in street, and so the track is embedded in the street, typically embedded in concrete, and so there's some very special rail profiles are used for that. Most common is on the left in this picture is girder rail, and you see the little protection for the flangeway that's built into the rail, and on the right there's a newer concept called tram rail, and that also has a protected flangeway, so these are designed to be embedded in concrete. Then you see in the picture here on the left rail, you can kind of see, but not very well, there's like a rubber boot that is that's installed between the concrete and the steel rail, and that's something that's evolved over the past few years to prevent stray currents from migrating from the streetcar rail. The negative return, this is DC traction. So the overhead wire is the power wire, and the return, the other half of the DC circuit, is almost universally operated through the running rail, and there have been cases where that return current looked for a shortcut back to the substation and started eating away at water pipes and things like that. So to reduce that effect, or pretty much eliminate that effect, it is practiced these days to encase streetcar rail in a rubber jacket to separate it from the concrete. So there's two different types of current collection. The historic is on the left, a trolley pole, and then on the right you see the pantograph. So that's the more modern concept. It's simpler to use. It can go in either direction, and they're a little more expensive, but it's simpler to use. So. All right. I had said that we were going to do another break in there, but we didn't. So it's 53. Yeah, I guess I did take a little bit longer, so I didn't rush through quite as quickly as I have in some last year. So, but I'd be happy to answer any questions now.
Hey, David, I have a question. On the street cars, do the rails have to be cleaned out? Ends are not a T-rail?
You mean the flangeways?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the biggest risk is in cold weather climates. It's easy to get accumulations of ice
Sure.
in the flangeway, and so you can find your streetcar wandering off down the street. instead of staying on the track. I mean, they are generally heavy enough that to break up the ice, but it can be an issue. And of course, yeah, you can have dirt accumulate in there, and but rarely does it require cleaning out as such. Yeah, I should have mentioned, I'm sorry, I did mean to mention in the streetcars, a new thing that's happened is battery operation is becoming fairly common. There's a couple of systems in the United States now have that, not typically for the entire system, but the maybe portions of the system where it's difficult or considered unsightly to have the trolley wire, and so they skip the wire for a short section or a longer section, and the car operates on battery power. The most interesting one is a route in Seattle that goes up a hill, so the uphill track is powered, but the downhill track is not. So they just kind of coast downhill, and actually, the braking power is they turn the motors into generators, and they use that power to charge the batteries. So, other questions? Nothing? Well, either we've lost everybody, or people are completely bored, or I was totally clear and there's no questions. So you feel free to contact me at any time. Just CD David Phillips by email, or you can find me in the phone in the directory on your phone.
All right, I just want to thank everybody for joining today's webinar. Please be sure to go in and take your quizzes online as soon as you can, and we will see you all next week. Thank you. Bye.
Okay.